Inspire, Inquire, Irk, Require that created a little bit of energy around your table. Either energy because we shared the experience, or because people pushed back against it, or anything about that. You want to put this on microphone so you can capture? So somebody who's willing to share a little bit. If you have a question, Irks are my favorite. I love the pushback. It's always fun. So you were just talking a lot. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll let you go first. So we're going to bring the microphone to you so that we can capture some of this stuff as we go. So thanks very much for doing that. Is it on?
Testing.
Yeah,
Okay,
there we go. Good.
Yeah, so there were two things I think that got us talking. The first thing was recognizing that some of our churches, the word adaptive is already a problematic word,
Good,
right? And
good,
just
yeah.
accepting the reality of where the church is headed to, or the decline perhaps of the church. The other thing was competing stories. Sometimes, especially because of members who have been there for a very long time.
Yes.
When you're trying to determine what that charism is, or when you're trying to figure out, what's that one narrative that kind of, says this is what we're proud of. Sometimes you actually have competition between those stories, and it becomes very difficult to navigate, especially when you're trying to bring about change, but you have the older members saying this is the actual story that represents our church, as opposed to the new ones who say, no, I think this is what our church stands for. So
Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. It's such a great insight. Because when we're at the place where we are dealing with competing stories, what we're actually talking about is competing values. So now we know we're in an adaptive moment, right? Like for us, what I want you to start getting used to is we get used to trying to fix people's anxiety. They say something, they push back, and we want to go, yeah, but. What you want to learn to do is use that anxiety to frame up the change. So imagine thinking about this. You can imagine someone saying, look, I'll give you an example of an actual church. And by the way, if I repeat myself, your job is just to laugh harder the second time. Okay? That's your job, because okay, so just so you know that. I was working with a group in Boston who were a second-generation Chinese Baptist church. The first generation were all immigrants who'd come from China, who were Baptists, who'd been reached by Baptist missionaries, who started a Chinese Baptist church. Like a lot of second-generation churches, the second generation wanted an English-speaking church. The English-speaking service, which had been the youth service that became the English-speaking service, now had grown to the place where they were trying to figure out, how do we relate to the mother service, right? What they realized was there's this church that was evolving, this church that was coming out of it, was neither Chinese nor Baptist. It was multi-ethnic, and it was more non-denominational. So now they were grappling with, you put them in a room and tell stories. The first generation tells stories about what it's like to be an immigrant congregation, and how important it was that we had a place where we could all speak our own language, feel at home, worship God in our own language in a strange world. The second generation started telling its stories, and its stories were not about being Chinese or Baptist, but what they discovered was their stories were a lot about immigrants coming from other countries who didn't feel like they had a place where they could belong, who found a group of people who, because we shared faith, not language, we could find community that would give us a place to belong. So the second generation church that speaks English is multi-ethnic, even though it's mostly Asian American, multi-ethnic, all immigrants. What they had in common was immigrants, not language. They had in common hospitality and welcome, not being Baptist. And what they had to recognize is the competing stories. One story was about our church was always about our people. The second generation story is our church was always about welcoming all people. They had to get to the root value to be able to move forward. So the competing values actually gave them a conversation to have that they had to then grapple with. But it starts with acknowledging that you have different sets of stories that are part of our DNA and part of what makes us really remarkable, and we have to own them. But the competing stories means we're actually we're going the right direction. It's an indicator. It's a hard one, but it's the right direction. It's like someone saying, hey, we're going to have to cross a mountain, and you start getting nervous if you don't see a mountain, right? Right? When you get to the mountain, it's going to be hard. We're going to have to go uphill. But it's worse thinking of, I know we're supposed to be crossing a mountain, and we're going downhill. What could be worse is actually going the wrong direction, right? And so you're there. So it's a great example. Good, thank you for that. Good, let's do a couple more. Just a couple more that came out of, conversations that came out of last time. Up here, thank you. I love making Will walk. It's a good thing. Yeah, awesome, awesome.
I think one of mine that we talked about a little bit was my irk.
Yeah.
The prominence of sabotage and resistance irks me a little bit.
Yeah.
Especially when, if we say this is what we want, or climbing the mountain or whatever, but then we're going to fight against it the whole time. That seems crazy to me.
Yeah, I know it does. It seems crazy, and yet it is so normal. We're going to actually talk about that this afternoon. We're going to end by starting to talk about the idea of sabotage and how we can begin to think about and normalize sabotage so that when we come back together again, we can start to learn about the formation we need for ourselves and the formation we need for our people. We need to become resilient in the face of sabotage. They need to become transformed through spiritual formation and discipleship to be less sabotaging. And both of those happen at the same time. Okay? Awesome. One more, please. One more. Over here. Thank you very much. Good, good, good.
Where was it at?
Right here. This table.
I think tagging along with what has already been said, I really struggle. It's more than a little irk. I
Yeah.
struggled with the reality, on one hand, that people love the Lord
Yep.
and want to serve Him,
Yeah.
desire to share the gospel,
Yeah.
yet
Right.
when things don't go their way, and across the board, I mean, not
Yeah.
just
Oh,
one
yeah.
side,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
other
yeah,
two,
Yeah.
they become, I mean, people react differently. They become so mean,
Yeah. They do.
vicious.
They do.
I don't understand that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, can you accept a brother or a sister that maybe doesn't see things your way? And can you find a place to still worship, to still be gracious? And it just, that we were talking here, in the struggles, whether the church is small or big,
Yeah.
still are there. And that's
Still
so
there.
painful, because I think that's the distraction then that takes us in this completely
Yep.
lost tangents instead of being about the gospel. And I just think, why do we continue to do that? Why?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's not even, okay, you do this and I do that, it's like, why are they doing that?
Exactly. It
So,
gets really,
we didn't try to do all of it the same. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to do this group this and this group that. No.
Yeah.
We want to do it this way, and they need
they
to
should
do it this way. I'm
too.
like,
Yeah, exactly,
Can you
right,
just
yeah,
let those
yeah,
other people?
yeah.
No.
And the answer is no, they can't.
And I'm thinking, can you listen to
And
how
the answer
they
is no-
worship?
and the answer is no, they
it's just,
can't. Yeah.
I don't. Sorry, that's
Yeah.
enough.
And the reason I'm being clear about that is you're so not crazy. Like, it's so real. It's so real. So what we're going to work on is we're going to name that, and we're going to work on giving ourselves the best chance, which is there's a different way of approaching these things than we've approached in the past to give us the best chance for transformation. But we're also going to acknowledge that resistance is part of it. One of the mistakes that a lot of leaders make, if the first mistake is trying hard at the old things until you're exhausted, the second one is believing that if we just are stubborn in the face of resistance, eventually people will see the light and come. It seems noble, it seems courageous, it seems prophetic, right? What we have to learn actually is how to lead through resistance, not oppose resistance. And leading through resistance does not mean giving in to resistance either. So we'll be working on those things too. Okay, so it's really normal and makes tons of sense. So let's just start talking about the process. We're going to go back one more thing. Remember, the last thing we ended with was this notion of charism, right? You start by understanding that your church's change is going to be a healthy adaptation of its DNA. Any change you're going to bring to a church, think about this. If you get assigned to a congregation that has a history before you get there, you're a pastor or an associate pastor, if you get assigned there, if you walk in, if you are there for 30 years, it has a history before you and after you. You're part of it. But that DNA, that transformation, it starts with a value that's bigger than you. Why do I know this so well? I now have this thing called a son-in-law. I have a son-in-law. What a son-in-law means is there's this other family that I now relate to, whether I wanted to or not. My daughter fell in love with this really good guy, and now his family values affect my family values. And we have to figure out how they work together. And what's interesting is when I start thinking about this is someday I will have grandchildren, hopefully, praise be to God. I will have grandchildren, and they'll have my family values and his family values, right? They'll have my DNA, and they'll have his DNA. And what I realized is I love him. He's a great guy. But their family does some stuff that I think are a little nutty. And I know they think we do some stuff that they think is pretty nutty. And what's going to be weird is how do we make sure that someday I have grandchildren who are not just nuts, right? So think about this notion of DNA, this sense of your core values. For change to last, it has to be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA, of your core values. Your organization's DNA is its values. Remember what we said last time? Not your aspirational values. You haven't gotten your DNA, you haven't gotten your charism if what you're talking about is what you should be about. So even the disappointment we heard earlier from our friend was, why can't people be like that? And the answer is, it's like saying to me, Todd, how come you can't slam dunk a basketball? Well, have you seen me? I'm built like a fire plug. We don't get off the ground very high, right? Like there's not a lot of lift that comes out of the people in my family, right? You're asking people to do something that they don't have the DNA to do. So instead, you have to adapt the game. So healthy adaptation of the DNA of the group. So we started by telling about stories, right? And we asked you, put people in a group, tell stories, tell hero stories. When they tell hero stories, you get to values. That's what you get to. And the values may be competing. And so what you realize, though, these values actually tell us about who we actually are. They're not what we should be, but they are what we actually are. And they give us, these stories tell us about what's dear to us. And we have to remember that even though we have the stories are data, they're not discernment. Yeah, I'll say it again. The stories are data, they're not discernment. We take the data and we practice discernment. So leadership is always about discernment. This is who we are. What is a healthy version of that? So go back to my friends in Boston. One of the things that was happening in the room was the first generation is saying stuff like, our second generation English speaking is losing some of their Chinese heritage. And they're losing their commitment to their Baptist roots. And the second generation church is saying, yes, but what we're getting is a multi-ethnic church that looks more like the city of Boston today. We have an opportunity to welcome people into our church who can't find a church home anywhere else in churches that have been segmented by race. What we have in common is we share English, but what we also have in common is we're all immigrants. And mostly we're either first or second generation immigrants who've been shaped by the experience of being strangers in a strange land. And we have a chance to do something that other churches couldn't do. How can we honor the past? And what does the adaptation look like into the future, right? You ask those questions, and after the exercise, you start debriefing. So if you haven't yet, I'm hoping that you have, but if you haven't yet done the storytelling exercise, then I hope you will. I hope you just basically get people together, have them tell stories about heroes when you're most proud of us, actual stories, not aspirational stories, actual stories, and then together sit down with a couple of people who are on your team and just ask, what were the values, what surprised you, what'd you learn, what came out of it, okay? Try to, out of that, discern the sense of values. So let me just ask a couple of you just to practice this with me. Tell me a couple of things. Let me just start with one question. What surprised you? What did you learn by telling, those of you who did the storytelling exercise, what did you learn about? We've learned that one of the things we've already learned is different people tell different stories that can sometimes compete, right? What else did you learn by telling stories in your group? What did you learn? Please, go ahead. Yeah, the church. Yeah. Here, Will, sorry, we're going to keep you running, buddy.
So what I did, we have 3 founding members that are still alive.
Yeah.
One's 88, one's 86, the other one is probably 70. And so I sat down with them and individually
Yeah.
and asked them, tell me the story of the Claremont Church. And basically they told the story about how they had a burden that there was no Seventh-day Adventist church in Claremont.
Yep.
And it was a burden for the message to get the gospel out. Another thing was they came together and each family put $3,000, and this was in 1966.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
So that was a lot of money back
Yeah,
then.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so it was about burden for expanding the kingdom, getting the everlasting gospel out, also about
Sacrifice, yeah.
and how they all sacrificed. They bought a landfill, and the landfill became the church.
Yeah.
And so taking something that was useless.
I love that.
Right?
Oh my gosh, that'll preach.
Right,
I
right.
love that. You want that story.
Right,
You
right,
want that
right.
one. That's a
And,
good one.
you know, and so out of that, for us, I decided that we're going to do, we're going to give them a Sabbath, and they're going to tell the story. And they have all these pictures,
Yeah,
picture
beautiful,
albums, and we're
beautiful.
going to, you know, allow them to tell, because the new members have no clue.
Haven't heard. Yep.
And so to allow
Yep.
them to tell the
Yep.
story of the church to
Yep.
the new generation, which
Yep.
is, and they were, you know, primarily Caucasian. Now we're
Yeah.
multi-generational,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
And so another thing that was cool, they were okay with not being a white congregation anymore. You know, they were okay with the diversity. They were okay with handing over the
Yeah.
reins because they felt that the new generation was continuing to build on that sacrifice.
On that
Right.
the sense of the burden for the gospel sacrifice, we redeem anything,
Right,
right?
right.
Okay, have you done that storytelling exercise with anybody who's been new to the church?
No. So what we're gonna do next month?
Okay.
We're gonna start that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
My suggestion is, if it's possible, if you've already got a plan, don't worry about it. But if you've got a plan, do the new people before you have them tell the stories. And the reason for this is what you want to do is listen for both the competing values. You in the back of the room, can you tell me your name, please? Mitchell, I'm going to keep coming back to you because that was a really good thing. So I just didn't want to keep calling you with the hat, right? So as Mitchell said, look, you get these competing values. What you want to listen for is the competing, but you also want to listen for where did people already start picking up this DNA? Like, where do you hear people talking about a burden for the
Sacrifice,
gospel,
burden.
sacrifice, we redeem anything, right?
Right.
Where do you hear those values, and how are they adapted? And so what'll happen is, if people tell the stories and then they get up and tell theirs, you're going to experience this like aha, like oh my gosh, right? If you experience the tension, you're going to have a moment to say, how do we capture both of these? And I love the fact that this predominantly white congregation that would have been in the 1960s is
Right.
saying, there's something we didn't even realize. We weren't trying to plant something that was homogeneous. We wanted to
Right.
plant something for the gospel. So as the neighborhood changed, we changed.
Right,
There's a
right.
value in that that's pretty profound too.
Right.
Yeah. Really good. Really excellent. I love that you started with those older folks. That's great. A couple of other experiences. What was your experience like? Please, thank you. Let's go. We're going to keep passing the mic around, so everybody who wants to will have a chance to talk, and a few people who don't. Yeah.
So I went around at potluck after church. We had a potluck. We have it once a month. So this past Sabbath, we had a potluck, and I walked around from table to table. I interviewed as many people as I could. I asked them, what brought you to Arlington Church, and why did you stay? And if I had time, I asked them, is there any particular person that was really meaningful to you being here? And I asked from the most elderly person, who's one of the only ones still left in his generation. We lost a lot of them those last couple years.
Yep, of course.
I asked him, it was, and then I asked the youngest, which is Gen Z, a young adult. So between all those, a lot of middle age as well. And the major theme that came out of the whole thing, almost every single person mentioned family. This is like family.
This place is like family.
This
to me.
place is like family. And they also said, they also used the term home. This
Home.
is home.
Huh.
Family and home kept coming up over and over again. Almost every single person mentioned family and home.
Interesting.
And then another thing they said was, because this is like family, this is like home, we feel like we are able to serve. We have the ability to serve because the church is small enough and family enough so that I can serve. I can participate in this church, whereas in bigger churches I can't do that. And then the other thing was our senior pastor. He's been in there They're, 13 years or so.
Yeah.
And I've been there about 10. So they feel like they can really connect with him because he is relatable.
Mm-hmm.
He's very social. And again, feels like home
Yeah.
because he's like
Yeah.
homely
Yeah.
type of
Yeah.
relatable
Yeah.
and relational. So
Homey.
they have that whole, this home, this family was just in everything, and almost everyone said it. There were also other things that came up, like theology, coming to Arlington because leaving La Sierra or Corona. Anyway, we've gotten a lot of people coming from other places because they didn't connect with the theologies in other places, and they ended up there. So I think part of my struggle has always been, what if we go outside and walk around the neighborhood?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I was
right.
feeling that irking there in that moment because I'm like, if we go around, we see the people in the neighborhood. It's not about, and will they feel at home? I don't
Exactly,
think
right,
that they
okay.
would feel at
Okay,
home.
good.
And so when I preach and I teach and stuff, I'm like, let's listen to people in our community. Let's go out there. Let's connect. Let's make our place actually home, grace oriented, and not just because people often also would say like, this is home because these people agree with me. I feel like I connect with them, and so it feels like home. And I'm like, well, let's make it home for everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do a couple things with this. I mean, in fact, we'll come back to some of these other stories. This is really interesting. So if you start by asking people, so why'd you come here? They'll almost always tell you it felt like home. It felt like family. It's familiar to me, which is not bad. It's a beautiful thing. But what you already got to, what is your name? Deirdre. What Deirdre already got to is the problem with being a family and being home. If you tell me, oh, this church is a family, I think to myself, well, I'm not in your family. Matter of fact, I'm not sure I want to be in your family. Matter of fact, I got enough problems with family on my own. Right? And especially when you start talking about what happens when you start bringing people into family who don't feel like they're family, okay? So the question you got to do is you got to get below it, and you got to ask, when you did it, it was really great, what was it that made this place feel like home? And now you got to the values, right? You could serve. You could know the pastor, right? We're small enough where you can serve and you're important. You got to roll. I mean, I always say, you know your family if you have to stay later and clean the dishes, right? The guests to go home. The family stays like, you're not going home yet. We got dishes to do. Like guests go home. Family stays and does the dishes, right? So you can serve here. You can know the pastor. You can be connected personally to people. And we share some common theology. We share some common beliefs. Those might very well be the kind of core values of the church. We're going to have to talk about how those adapt for our mission, right? You don't change them. You don't want to get rid of them, but you have to adapt them. So what does it mean to be a church where people can get to use their gifts, people can be connected relationally to the people in leadership, and where we actually figure out what we share? You know, all you need is a family to go more than one generation, and not everybody believes the same thing, right? Had anybody come home from college? Well, have you ever been the person who came home from college and was afraid to tell mom and dad what you were now thinking about? You know, like, we grew up in this home and we all believe this. You know, here's another way of thinking about it. Oh my gosh, you know that's a bad Thanksgiving dinner, right? But that's family. Like, family has to be more than just we all agree, right? So you start reframing that notion. I also want you, just in the back of your head, pay attention to whenever you hear family, you should have the same, like, both appreciation and little bell go off that says, okay, this is going to be hard, right? Like, family is hard. When I work with organizations and they tell me they're like family, I say we're going to need to work on that metaphor. Because like family is different than being a community, a people, a fellowship, right? They have to think about, if we were going to be a family that blesses all the families of the world, a la Genesis 12, that's different than being, we're a family where everybody who's here belongs to each other and we're insular, right? So so think about those values. And we often say, once you've determined what will never change, you must then be prepared to change everything else, okay? So here's the next skill set we're going to work on. Whenever you are taking on a new change, right? Whenever you're trying to work on a new experiment, what we're going to talk about today is learning how not to default to old programs or old plans. How to not default to the old things we do, to the old technical solutions. Instead of defaulting, we're going to disrupt it by observing. So here's the process that I want you to learn. And you'll be seeing this over and over again today. It's a process. We look at something. So even this, we just listened to a bunch of people tell stories. The first thing we're going to want to do is not solve the problem. It's make observations. And the way we talk about this is listening on the dance floor and looking from the balcony. So imagine that you're telling stories at a junior high dance. The music's blaring. It smells like Axe body spray. People are moving around. It's overwhelming. And if people were telling stories about how cool this place was and how great this community, this church was at a junior high dance, and you were listening to the stories and you said, here's what I heard people say. That's dance floor. Here's what I heard people say. Balcony is, imagine if you're the chaperone at a junior high dance and they said, hey, every hour or so we're going to swap, and those of you who've been out on the dance floor, you're going to go up on the balcony and you're going to watch from up top. Now, from up top, you can't hear what they're saying, but you can observe some stuff. Whatever that group is in the corner, they are not up to any good. I know whatever they're doing over there. I can't hear them, but I can see what they're doing over there. Oh, someone left the dance floor crying. I have no idea why, but he was crying when he walked off there, right? Oh my gosh, this person showed up and everybody celebrated. I don't know what it was about that person. They showed up and they all just started dancing more. We don't hear it, but we can see it. So one of the things you want to learn to do is make observations. What happens when, say, we put people together in a group and we ask them to tell stories? We hear the stories, but then we also see stuff like the tension. Or we see things like, oh my gosh, we missed telling stories. They're just so glad to be together. I couldn't get them to stop talking. Oh. Learning to make observations. So when I work with my doctoral students, we do every single thing we do. They spend a week where I do not let them get past observations and interpretations. If anybody in the group says, here's a problem in my church, we're having a hard time reaching our neighbors, and someone goes, you know what we do? My job is to go, stop. I don't want to hear what you do. Tell me what you heard. Tell me what you saw. Observations. The goal of observations is getting multiple observations, getting as many as possible. Don't worry about if they're good or bad. They're just observations. I see this. I hear that. You want to practice this? Take any event that you do in the life of your church, any event. Put a team together, a group of people together. Don't ask them how to go. Okay, let's debrief it. How do you all think it went? Ask them this. Tell me what you observed. What did you hear? What did you see? Someone's going to go, you know what I think we should do next time? Not yet. I think is interpretation. What'd you hear? What'd you see? Practice, practice, practice. Multiple observations. Quantity is more important than quality. So when I was in junior high, 13 years old, I took up photography. I loved the idea of being a photographer. I converted my mom's bathroom to a dark room because I needed to buy film, and it was so expensive that I needed to be able to develop my own pictures. By the time I was a junior in high school, I was the lead photographer in my high school yearbook. My daughter took up photography when she was 13 years old. By the time she was a junior in high school, she was a wedding photographer making thousands of dollars a year. What was the main difference between when I was a photographer and when my daughter was a photographer? Digital cameras. Why? Film doesn't cost anything. I would take 36 pictures and it would cost me $20 in 1978 dollars. $20 to get them developed. So I had to create a darkroom. I had to buy film in bulk. If I would go to an event, I would take maybe 40 pictures, maybe 50, and I'd have to crank them all out. My daughter could take 50 pictures in 5 minutes. She took thousands of pictures, and she got an entire photoshopping thing she could do where she could edit them and work on them and correct them. Quantity is more important than quality. Get as many observations as you possibly can. Get as many people. You try a new worship service, you do something new. Don't ask people, did it work? Say, what do you think? What do you hear? What did you see? They tell you, I heard them say this. I saw this. I saw people get really excited about stuff they didn't get excited about. I heard them say there was more energy in this room than they've experienced in the last 20 years. I saw people get cranky. They crossed their arms. They looked over it. They sang, shout to the Lord, all the earth, let us sing. I heard them say, when are we going to get back and be real church? Right? Observations. Then interpretations. Get as diverse interpretations as possible. So you have a bunch of people who said, I heard people call this church family and home. Go to as many diverse people as possible. People who've been here forever, people who've not been here. What does it mean? What do you think when you hear the word family? Hear the differences in their interpretation. Learn to ask really good questions. One person says, family means I belong here. Another person says, family means I don't think I ever want to go there. Right? When you hear home, what do you think? I think it's home for other people, but not for me. Oh. Get as diverse interpretations. We start realizing is when people look at the same material from the same thing. How many times have you been in an event where someone said, that was a great event, and someone else said, well, I thought it was a great event, but it would have been nice to have something besides 4 50-year-old white guys talking. Someone else says, well, wait a minute. Do we really want to be about that, caring about what people look like up front? Isn't it really about the message? And someone else says, I think it matters. Right? I think it might matter. I think if you can't see the diversity of the church up front, it's going to be hard. I know churches who, if you look at the congregation, it looks diverse, but if you look at the platform, it looks like 1958. Right? And all of a sudden, someone just notices it. Someone just says, hey, look, I observe this. If you look this way, it looks diverse. It looks like the kingdom of God. It looks like Revelation 7. Here, it looks like 1958. What do you think? I think there's a lot of people up there who would feel really awkward if we told them we didn't want them to be up there because we need to get other people up there. That would be painful. Yeah. Learn not to make solutions. Learn to make observations and interpretations, right? We're going to talk about this over and over and over again. This is the process. Make multiple observations, seek out diverse interpretations, formulate new questions, and then conduct playful interventions. That's the process that we're going to talk about as we go, okay? Any questions about this part? We're going to take a bit of a break in a moment so we can all stretch, a little bio break, get some food, whatever, and then we're going to jump in. But anything about this part that we talked about so far? Everything so far, it's all been review. We want to make sure we anchor it in. Inquiry, or here we go, please.
When you're asking multiple people to make observations,
Yeah.
do you think it's helpful or hurtful to be a little leading with how they do that?
Leading how? How would you like to lead them?
In terms of, like, what kinds of things are you listening for? What kinds of things are you watching for? Like, are you then pointing out things that are going to be helpful and actually, like, getting you observations, or I'm almost done.
Yeah.
Or do you just, if they don't have too much critical thinking in their head, they're going to see some things that aren't helpful to you, that's fine.
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. Very often we think about asking questions in a way that is helpful to get to our agenda. What I actually want you to practice is being really curious and not have an agenda. Think about this. I have to often tell myself this. I know what I think. I have a lot of opinions. I got opinions about stuff that other people haven't even thought about. And they're pretty firm. And if you ask me, I'll give them to you. What I often do is assume I know what you think. So what I want to do is ask questions so I can learn what you think. Oh my gosh, I didn't even realize. This is what they think. They actually think that. So get curious. Make observations. The more curious you can make, even the more interpretations. Why do they interpret it that way? Right? You start recognizing that it's the only way that you can begin to get more data. So try not to be leading at this. When we get to interventions and explore questions, we'll get a little more focused. But at this stage, as open as possible.
Can I follow up?
Please.
What I'm finding is that
Go ahead, say this because I think this is really good.
what I think that I'm finding is that when I ask people what they've seen or what they've heard and then
Yeah.
ask them to reflect on that, they have less reflection.
Yep.
And so then I'm like, what? like, oh, you don't think about anything. No.
Okay, so let me give you a I didn't plan this, but here's actually a really good question that you can, this is the new question that I've been getting to ask people. If somebody gives you an opinion, they give you an opinion like stuff like, I think people in the church today don't take the Bible seriously. Really? Tell me how where you see that. Well, have you noticed nobody carries their Bible nobody carries their Bibles to church. They're all on their phones. Internally, you're thinking, you know that everybody under 40 has a Bible on their phone, right? You could correct them, but instead ask them this question. What in your life experience got you to that? And you'll hear them tell a story like this. When I was growing up, you could hear the pages turn in the pews. When I was growing up, everybody knew their Bibles. We used to do sword drills. Did you guys? I just dated myself, right? Like we would have right? We used to, people took the Bible seriously in my generation. I think people this generation don't take the Bible seriously. They might be totally wrong, but it's nice to know that, right? It's better to know that. Think of it as a data point, right? Okay? Awesome, good. Okay, let's be back here at, say, 25 up. You get like 7 minutes, not a long time, right? 7 or 8 minutes to take a little break. We'll come back and we'll get started again. Okay.